They said the stage would not stop long at 9 Mile, and Cora Whitfield meant to be off it before anyone could see her hands shake. She gathered her carpetbag, straightened the collar of her one good dress, grey from washing rather than dye, and stepped down into a street bright with August dust. Certain that within the hour a man she had never met would take one look at her and send her straight back east, penniless, with nowhere to go and no fare to get there. That was, after all, the whole design of the joke. She had spent 3 years at Mrs. Sewing House earning her keep with a needle, mending the gowns of girls who would never have to mend their own, and she had told herself, through every one of those years, that a roof and 2 meals a day were more than an orphan with no name behind her had any right to expect. She had learned to make herself small in rooms full of laughter that was never meant to include, to keep her eyes on her stitching when the other girls spoke of abuse and dances, to want nothing out loud because wanting out loud only ever seemed to invite someone crueler to take it from her. When the ticket west had been pressed into her hand, she had understood it for exactly what it was, not an opportunity, but a trap dressed up as one, and had taken it anyway, because even a trap, she reasoned, was a door. And she had spent long enough on the other side of every door in that house to no longer much care what lay beyond one, so long as it was somewhere else. She had not written the letter that brought her here. Vivian Cross had written it laughing, while the other boarders at Mrs. Pruitt's sewing house in St. Louis crowded around to add their own cruelties, answering a rancher's advertisement for a wife in Cora's name and signing it with a flourish that was not her hand at all. A plain, penniless seamstress, no family, no dowry, and grateful for any man's charity. That was what they had written word for word, while Cora mended the very gown Vivian meant to wear to a dance with Beale Cora had once, briefly, dared to smile at. It was meant to end in a letter of polite refusal, a joke to be read aloud and laughed over for a week. Instead, a reply had come back with 2 words underlined, "Come West," and a bank draft for her passage, and Vivian, delighted at the prospect of humiliation delivered in person rather than by post, had pressed the ticket into Cora's hand herself. Now Cora stood in the ankle-deep dust of a cattle town with $11 sewn into her hem, a return fare she'd not have, and the growing certainty that she had walked into her own ruin with her eyes open, because she had nothing left to lose by trying. A man was crossing the street toward her, and she knew him at once, though no one had troubled to describe him. He moved like a man who owned the ground he walked on and did not need to say so, broad through the shoulders, sun-browned, his hat pushed back to show a face that was not unkind, though it was not soft either. Lucas Harden. She had seen his name at the bottom of the advertisement a dozen times in the weeks since, turning it over the way she turned over any word that might decide her fate. He stopped a few feet off and looked at her for a long moment, and Cora made herself hold still under it, chin up, waiting for the disappointment to cross his face the way it always did on people who had expected someone else. "You're Miss Whitfield," he said instead, and it was not a question, and there was nothing in his voice but a kind of careful relief. "I was told to look for a woman traveling alone with a grey bag. I didn't expect you'd be standing in the sun waiting to be sent home before I'd even said good day." "I thought I ought to save you the trouble of working up to it," Cora said, and hated how thin her voice came out. Something shifted in his face then, not amusement at her expense, but something gentler, as if he understood more than she'd said. "Ma'am, I don't know what you were told to expect from me, but I didn't send 200 miles for a woman so I could look her over and turn her back around. I sent for a wife. If you're willing, I mean to keep to that." It was, Cora thought, the first time in longer than she could remember that anyone had told her they meant to keep a promise to her, and she did not know what to do with the sudden, humiliating sting of tears behind her eyes, so she looked instead at the town behind him, the mercantile. The bank with its brick face freshly painted, the ranch land beyond the rooftops rolling green gold to a line of hills, and made herself say only, "Then I'm willing, Mr. Harden." He took her bag before she could stop him, and it was the lightness of it in his big hand, she thought later, that seemed to trouble him most, as though a person's whole life ought to weigh more than that. The ride out to the ranch took the better part of an hour, and Lucas talked the way a careful man talks, giving her time rather than filling silence, about the herd, about the house his father had built, about the drought 2 summers back that had nearly finished them. He did not ask about her family or her past, and Cora understood, gratefully, that he was leaving room for her to tell it in her own time, if she chose to tell it at all. She did not yet. She was too busy trying to memorize the shape of a kindness she still expected to be withdrawn. The ranch itself took her breath in a way she had not let herself hope for. A long, low house of good timber, corrals full of strong stock, hands moving about their work with the unhurried competence of men who were paid fair and treated well. A woman came out onto the porch to meet them, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. "This is Odessa Byrne," Lucas said. "Her husband Silas runs the outfit for me. Odessa's run this house since before I could walk, and she'll tell you plainer than I will if you're doing something wrong. I'll tell her plainer if she's doing something right too," Odessa said, and took Cora's hand in both of hers, warm and dry and strong. "Coming out of that sun, child. You look like you haven't eaten a whole meal since Missouri." She had not, in fact, eaten a whole meal since Missouri, and something about being seen so exactly, so kindly, nearly undid her on the porch steps. The first days settled into a rhythm gentler than any Cora had known. She rose early from habit and found there was always work waiting that did not feel like penance. Mending harness leather and shirt cuffs, learning from Odessa which hands took their coffee strong and which took it sweet. Walking the near pasture in the cool of morning while Lucas checked fence line, matching her stride to his without either of them remarking on it. On the third evening he brought her his father's old coat, the lining torn loose at one shoulder, and sat with her on the porch step while she mended it, telling her without being asked that his mother had died the winter he turned 12, and that his father had worn that coat every day afterward until the day he too was buried in it near enough, and that Lucas had never once been able to bring himself to give it away. Cora sewed the lining fast and even, and when she handed it back to him whole he held it a long moment before he spoke, and said only that it was the first time in 6 years the coat had felt like something other than a wound. She understood then, with a tenderness that startled her, that she had not been brought here merely to keep a house. She had been brought here to help a lonely, careful man carry what he had been carrying alone, and that he had begun, however cautiously, to let her. It did not take a week for Cora to understand that not everyone in 9 Mile shared Odessa's welcome. She felt it first at church, in the particular quality of the silence that followed her down the aisle, and then more sharply at the Mercantile, where a young woman in a walking dress the color of ripe plums looked her up and down with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "So you're the male bride," the woman said. "I confess I expected someone more. Lucas Harden could have his pick, you know. I'm surprised he settled for a seamstress with a borrowed dress and a bag that wouldn't fill a saddlebag." "I don't believe we've been introduced," Cora said, keeping her voice level though her face burned. "Loretta Vance," the woman said, as though the name alone should explain everything, and perhaps, in 9 Mile, it did. Her father and the bank, Cora would learn before the week was out, owned a note on the Harden ranch large enough to matter a great deal. That evening, over supper, Odessa told her the rest of it plainly, the way she told Cora most things. Lucas's father had borrowed heavily against the ranch during the drought to keep the herd fed and the hands paid, and old man Vance had carried the note kindly enough while he lived. But young Vance, Loretta's father now, since the elder banker's passing, had made it known, in the careful, deniable way such things were made known, that the note might be renegotiated on easier terms if certain families were joined by marriage rather than merely by business. Loretta had set her sights on Lucas a year gone, and every reason to believe the match a settled thing until an advertisement for a mail-order bride had appeared in an Eastern paper and upended her plans entirely. He didn't want her, Odessa said, low, over the washing up. Not for a wife, whatever her father wants. Lucas said as much to Silas, said he wouldn't be bought into a marriage same as his father was near bought out of his land, said he wanted somebody who'd choose him plain, and be chosen plain in return, not somebody counting his acres. That's why he placed that notice at all. Cora set down the plate she was drying, cold all the way through despite the warm kitchen. If that was true, if Lucas Harden had wanted above everything a wife who came to him without scheming, without design, then she was built on precisely the wrong foundation, a woman delivered to his door by a joke crueler than he knew, dressed up as choice when it had been, from the very first word of that letter, someone else's cruelty wearing her name. She did not sleep well that night, turning the thought over long after the house had gone quiet, and the morning she resolved to do the only honest thing left to her. She would tell him the truth before she let him get any further into caring for her, and let him decide, with full knowledge, whether he wanted to keep his promise or be released from it. She did not get the chance that day, nor the next, because a letter arrived from St. Louis addressed in Vivian Cross's careless hand, and Cora, reading it alone in the yard with her back to the house, felt the ground go out from under her a second time. "I do hope the rancher was suitably disappointed," Vivian had written, delighting in her own wit. "We laughed for a week picturing his face. Do write and tell us how quickly he sent you home. Mrs. Prout says she'll take your old room back the day you return, so don't dawdle finding your own way, penniless as you are. It was only ever meant as a joke, Cora, you understand. No one truly thought he'd send for you at all." Cora read it twice, then folded it small and pressed the heel of her hand hard against her mouth, because if she made a sound she was not certain she would be able to stop. It was Lucas who found her there, come in from the far pasture earlier than expected, and one look at her face told him plainly that something in that letter had cut deep. Cora, it was the first time he had used her given name, and something in the gentleness of it broke the last of her resolve to hide it. "You should read this," she said, and held the letter out with a hand that would not stay steady, "and then you should decide whether you still want me under your roof, because I think you deserve to know the truth of how I came to be here before you decide anything more." He read it standing in the yard, the wind pulling at the paper, and Cora watched his jaw tighten by degrees, watched something harden in his eyes that she feared, in that first terrible moment, was aimed at her. "They wrote this as your name," he said finally, as a cruelty. "To you." "To humiliate me," Cora said, "and I let it happen, because I had nowhere else to go and no other prospect in the world, and I told myself I would be honest with you the moment I found the courage, and I am ashamed it took a letter forcing my hand to do it." Lucas folded the paper with a care that surprised her and handed it back. "You didn't write a word of it," he said. "You didn't ask to be mailed out here like a parcel for somebody else's amusement. Cora, I have spent a year being courted by a family that wants my acres more than they want me, and not 1 hour of that courtship ever felt as honest as you standing in the street, telling me to my face you expected to be sent home. I don't care how the letter that brought you was written. I care what you've done since you got here, and what you've done is work harder, and complain less, and treat my people kinder than anyone Loretta Vance ever sent to this house." He paused, and something almost rueful crossed his face. "If anything, I owe your Miss Cross a debt I don't intend to ever repay her for. She sent me the finest thing that's happened to this ranch since my mother passed," meaning it as an insult. Cora did not trust her voice enough to answer him in words, so she let him take her hand instead, work roughened in his own, and stood with him a long moment in the wind-scoured yard while something long clenched in her chest finally, carefully eased. In the weeks that followed, something between them shifted from careful courtesy into a bond neither of them named aloud, but both of them plainly felt. Lucas took to finding reasons to ride the near range at the hour Cora walked out to gather eggs, and Cora took to finding reasons to bring coffee out to the corral when he was breaking a green colt, and neither fooled Odessa for a moment, though she was kind enough not to say so beyond a knowing smile over the supper dishes. He taught her to sit a horse properly one golden evening, his hands steady at her waist as he showed her how to find her balance, and when she finally trotted a full circle of the near pasture without his hand to steady her, the look on his face was one of such open, unguarded pride that Cora had to look away before he saw exactly how much it undid her. The hands, too, warmed to her by degrees, Silas touching his hat brim to her now instead of merely nodding, the cook saving her the good end of the roast, the 14-year-old boy, Tommy, trailing after her on Sunday afternoons to be taught his letters, since it turned out the plain penniless seamstress could read finer than half the county, and had simply never been asked to prove it. Cora began, for the first time she could remember, to feel less like a guest awaiting judgment and more like a woman building something that might, if she was careful and brave enough, be allowed to last. But the letter, once loosed into the small world of 9 Mile through a careless remark of Loretta's cousin at the mercantile, could not be called back. and within days the whole town seemed to know some version of the story. Cora Whitfield, the joke bride, sent west by cruel girls to be humiliated. And wasn't it a scandal that Lucas Harden kept her on regardless? Loretta seized on it with the delight of a woman handed a weapon she had not had to forge herself, and let it be known in her careful, smiling way that she meant to read the letter aloud at the town's harvest social, where half the county would gather, so that everyone might judge for themselves what manner of bride the Harden ranch had settled for. Her father, meanwhile, sent word through the bank's clerk that the note on the ranch would be called due at season's end unless renegotiated, and everyone in 9 Mile understood exactly what terms would make renegotiation convenient. Lucas told Cora none of it directly. She heard it from Odessa, grim-faced over the bread duff, and from Silas, who came in from town with his hat brim pulled low and would not meet her eye until she asked him outright. She understood, hearing it, precisely what her presence had cost the man who had chosen to keep her, and it frightened her far worse than any cruelty Vivian Cross had ever managed, not the fear of being sent away, but the fear of being the reason a good man lost the land his father had died defending. She resolved that she would not be the ruin of him, whatever it took, and set herself instead to becoming, before the harvest social, the kind of woman no one in that county could dismiss with a laugh, not for pride's sake, but because she had begun. Somewhere in the long ordinary days of mending shirts and doctoring calves, and sitting up with Odessa over the account books, to love this ranch, and the man who ran it more than she had ever let herself love anything she was afraid to lose. The trouble, when it came from the sky rather than the town. A dry lightning storm rolled through 2 days before the social, striking with up of rain to follow it, and by the time Silas's shout carried up from the south pasture, a line of grass fire was already crawling toward the hay barn and the winter feed stacked inside it. Feed enough to see the herd through to spring, feed that could not be replaced this late in the season at any price the ranch could bear. No to no note. Every able hand was out with the cattle already, scattered across the far range chasing spooked stock away from the flames, and Lucas among them, too far off to reach the barn in time. It was Cora who saw the smoke first from the kitchen window, and Cora who'd not wait for anyone's permission before she was running for the well with every bucket the house owned and shouting for Odessa to ring the yard bell. She organized what hands remained, the aging cook, Tommy, Odessa herself, into a line from the well to the barn's near wall, soaking every sack and blanket the house owned and beating back the creeping edge of flame while Tommy rode bareback for the men. The smoke came thick and black, rolling low across the yard, and the heat of it pressed against her skin like a hand shoving her back even as she pressed forward. Twice the wind gusted and drove a tongue of flame across the gap she had thought secured, and twice she beat it down with a soaked sack before it could catch the dry timber of the wall, her arms screaming with the effort, her breath coming in short scorched pulls. Her hands blistered raw on the rope of the well bucket. Smoke stung her eyes until she could barely see the line she was walking. At one point a gust drove the fire close enough that she felt the heat of it catch the back of her hand before Odessa hauled her bodily out of its path. Shouting at her to fall back, and Cora, coughing, only picked up the next sack and went on. She would not, she told herself with a fierce, wordless certainty that surprised her, be the reason this family lost what it had spent a lifetime building, not to fire, not to a bank note, not to anything. By the time Lucas came pounding into the yard at the head of 6 riders, half the barn's wall was blackened and smoking, but the barn itself, and every sack of hard-won feed inside it still stood, and Cora stood with it, suit streaked and swaying but upright, the bucket still in her raw hand. He was off his horse before it had fully halted, and across the yard in a handful of strides, and the look on his face as he took her scorched hand in both of his was not the look of a man assessing damage to his property. "You could have been killed," he said, low and rough. "So could the winter feed," Cora said, "and I'd rather have blistered hands than a starved herd and a bank note you can't pay because of it." She did not say the rest of it, that she had run toward the fire, without a moment's hesitation, because somewhere in these past weeks this ranch had become hers to defend as surely as it was his. But she thought he read it anyway, in the set of her jaw and the suit on her face, and the fact that she had not once in the telling mentioned being afraid. The harvest social went forward 2 nights later regardless, the whole county turning out in its good clothes to the long hall strung with lanterns, and Cora walked in on Lucas's arm with her bandaged hand tucked against his sleeve, aware of every eye that found her and every whisper that followed. Loretta Vance found her within the hour, the folded letter visible at the edge of her reticule, a smile fixed and bright as a knife's edge. "I thought the county ought to hear, in your own words as it were, just how you came to be here, Miss Whitfield," Loretta said, pitched to carry, drawing the eyes of the nearest dancers, "since you've been shy about telling it yourself." "Go ahead and read it," Cora said, before her courage could fail her, surprising herself with how steady her voice came out. "I've nothing left to hide from it. Read it to the whole hall if you like. Read them how your friend Vivian Cross thought it a fine joke to send a penniless seamstress 200 miles to be turned away and shamed, because she couldn't bear that a man once looked at me and not at her. I won't stop you. I expect most everyone here already knows the shape of it by now, and I'd rather they heard it plain than whispered." The hall had gone quiet enough by then that Lucas's voice, when he stepped forward, carried to every corner of it without him needing to raise it. "And while she's reading," he said, "I'll thank the county to hear the rest of the story too, since Miss Vance seems set on telling half of it. This woman ran into a grass fire 2 days ago with her bare hands rather than let this ranch lose its winter feed, and she did it before a single one of you decided whether her arriving here was scandal enough to gossip over. I don't much care how the letter that sent her was written or by whom or why. I care that she's the finest thing to happen to my house since my mother died, and I mean to marry her, joke letter and all, and any man or bank in this county that thinks that's a matter for renegotiation can bring the argument to me directly instead of to my future wife's back." The silence that followed broke, after a long moment, not into scandal but into something Cora had not expected at all, a low ripple of approval, an old rancher's wife calling out, "Well said," from the back, Odessa beaming outright by the punch table, Silas nodding once, hard, as if a fact long settled had only just been said aloud where it counted. Loretta's smile had gone thin and brittle at the edges, and she looked down at the letter still clutched in her gloved hand as though it had turned to something shameful in front of the whole hall. "You needn't read it," Cora said to her, quietly now without triumph in it. "I know what it says better than anyone here. I've carried it a good deal longer than you have, Miss Vance. And I find I'm tired of letting it decide who I'm allowed to be." For just a moment something uncertain crossed Loretta's face, not kindness, not quite, but something nearer to the recognition of a woman who had also, perhaps, spent a season being weighed and found wanting by people who never once asked what she wanted for herself. She said nothing more, only folded the letter smaller and smaller until it disappeared into her reticule, and when her father, hovering near the door, understood the shape of public opinion turning firmly against him, he found urgent business elsewhere before the evening was out, and no more was said in 9 miles of renegotiating any note at all. Lucas married Cora Whitfield 3 weeks later in the same long hall, decked now in ribbon rather than gossip, with Odessa weeping happily into a handkerchief and half the county in attendance to see for themselves that the joke bride had become, by every measure that mattered, the lady of 9 miles' finest ranch. Vivian Cross's cruel little letter, Cora kept folded in the bottom of a trunk for years afterward, not out of bitterness, but because she liked, on the hardest days, to take it out and remember that even a cruelty meant to break her had somehow, against every intention, carried her home. And when her husband took her scarred hand in his each evening on the porch and told her, as he told her every evening after, that he had never once in his life been so glad of a joke gone wrong, Cora understood at last that she had not been sent west to be humiliated at all. She had been sent west to be found.